Hey everybody, welcome to Prairie Lakes Church. We're really glad you're joining us. Welcome to June, and which is crazy, but happy start to the summer here. Hey, last weekend we started a series that we're going to continue this weekend. Just walking through the book of Exodus, lessons from Exodus. We're talking about like when life with God, ... okay? And so here's where we've been and here's where we're going. When life with God, last week we talked about when life with God gets tough. This week, when life with God gets dangerous. Next week, when it isn't enough, it doesn't feel like it's enough. And then finally, when life with God just feels like it's out of our control, okay? So just a couple of reminders as we reset. First, if you missed, we did a lot of introductory stuff to the book of Exodus last week. So if you feel like I missed it last week, it's Memorial Day, go back and grab onto that. But one thing I want to just remind us all of here as we get going is just what does the word Exodus mean, okay? So Exodus literally means to pull away. And the story of Exodus, second book in the Bible, is God pulling his people away from or out of the nation of Egypt, and they were enslaved in bondage there. That's really the story. And so last week, we ended the first few chapters of Exodus, ended that story at the place where God's called a man named Moses to go back to Egypt, to go straight to Egypt's king, Pharaoh, and to relay a message from him. And so here's God's message to Pharaoh through Moses. Pharaoh, God has said that you are to let his people go. God, let my people go so that they may go free and worship me. That was the message. And what Pharaoh had done, he had enslaved the Israelite tribes for at least 30 years or so. But even worse than that, and we talked about this last week, he issued a decree that was really infanticide. It was killing all of the baby Hebrew boys as a population control measure. So just a horrific, crazy start to the story. And that's why we talked about, when life with God gets tough. But now God had promised to pull them out of slavery. And that's basically the story through Exodus 6. Now, Pharaoh thought this demand from this mystery God was pretty amusing. And what he's about to find out in the next part of the story is that God's not messing around. God's not playing around. So kind of like we did last week, let's just do a brief overview now of Exodus, the story, Exodus 7 through 12. So here's kind of the deal. We're going to fly over a lot of stuff. But in these kind of 5 or 6 chapters here, God sends increasingly severe plagues on Egypt. And he does each with a warning. I'm going to do this if you don't let my people go. And he does it. He goes, I'm going to do something worse if you don't let my people go. And he does it, okay? Now what happens is Pharaoh resists at first. I don't care about the frogs. I don't care about the blood. I don't care about the locusts or whatever they were, right? But then as they get worse, Pharaoh relents and he goes, fine, take them. I'm sick of this. But as soon as he relents, Pharaoh recants. So he resists and then he relents and then he recants and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. He does that until God gives him a final warning. And that's, if you don't let my people go, I'm going to kill all of the firstborn in Egypt, firstborn males in Egypt. And Pharaoh doesn't. And so God ends up bringing Pharaoh's infanticide to justice. He balances the scale by that plague, okay? And so finally, Pharaoh says, go. And so what we see here in these chapters is the newly freed Israelites are celebrating the first Passover, which is pretty significant as well. So the time we get to Exodus 12, we see God make good on what he promised to do. And this is really where the book gets its title, because this part of the story, he starts literally pulling his people out of Egypt, okay? So let's just catch up. This is in Exodus 12 now, verses 31 and 32. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and he said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and go. And also bless me. And that's kind of significant because when Pharaoh says bless me, he's kind of recognizing your God is the God that's in charge. Put in a good word for me. Okay? And then we get to 40 and 41. It says, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. 430 years to the day. That's pretty crazy. 430 years is, I think it's a hard one for us as Americans to grasp. I mean, 430 years ago, we were, still, 100, 150 years away from even being a thing. But that's how long the Israelite tribes were in Egypt. Now, they weren't slaves for that entire duration, right? Only for the last several of those decades, but they were slaves long enough for that to be imprinted on them, be part of their identity, okay? So that's 7 through 12, and then we get to chapter 13. And this is what we're going to do, start diving into some stuff here, okay? So 13, follow with me, 17 and 18. Here's how it goes. So when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Okay. We're going to get into all of those yellow words here in a second and why those are so important. But first, maybe a little bit of a geography lesson here. Because it says that God led the people around the desert road by the Red Sea instead of like on the road through the Philistine country. What does that mean? Is that like a 2-lane versus 4-lane situation, like back roads versus interstate? No, not really. In fact, let me give you a little visual here, okay? Here's what you're looking at. So up here, there's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, and we've got modern day Israel, right? And then we've got the Mediterranean Sea right here, and then Egypt is down here, and then there's the Red Sea, okay? And those are all still real places, right? I mean, this is not a made up map. But way back then, the Israelites would have started here in Ramses, and a straight line, right? Point A to point B is what? A straight line from where they were start to where God had promised them up here in Israel, would have been just right along the coast, right? Right along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That would have been the shortest distance. If we're kind of tracking that in miles, from here to here is around 200 miles, okay? 200 miles or so. It would be like walking from our Decorah campus all the way to our Fort Dodge campus on foot, plus around an additional 35 miles, say, okay? So it's kind of a distance. So let's say you walk at a 3-mile-an-hour pace, and let's say you're gonna do that for 6 hours a day. Really just 6 hours a day? How come not 8? How come not 12? Well, if you're in Israel, you're in a large caravan. You're going to stop for meals. You're going to set up and tear down camp every night. You kind of have to sleep. So let's just say that though, okay? So 3 miles per hour, 6 miles a day means you're going around 18 miles a day, which makes it, from here to here would be at about 11 or 12 days, give or take. That's a long trip by today's standards of transportation, right? But not so much. Not so much for theirs. So the straightest line, quickest path. Now, here's what the text says: that God did not lead them through there because of it being Philistine country. God instead leads them south, away from the Philistines. He leads them south. And he leads them on a route that ends up being a lot longer, and not just because that's where he's leading us, because they're wandering, and that's something we'll talk a little bit more about later. Now, there's no way for us to know what was the exact route, the exact one. We know mostly, but our best guess is this: if this is 200 miles, what this route ends up being is closer. I like that right there because they kind of wandered there too. Is closer to 500 miles. The difference between the blue line and the yellow line is 300 miles. And just to give you a scale there, 300 miles is a RAGBRAI trip. That's like tacking on a little, Missouri to Mississippi stroll to your journey through the desert, okay? So this is what God did. Not a straight line, but that way. The question is, why? Because if you would have read that and you would have lived during that time, you would have been like, why? Why did he do that? Well, it's it's because the Philistines controlled the territory through that straight line part. And here's what God knew, and here's what the text says. It says, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. That's what God was concerned about. They would change their minds if they had to face war and then return to Egypt. Which, if you just read the first part of the story, you go, really? Really? Return to Egypt? Go back to the place where they were making bricks without straw? With no pay? Go back to the place that killed all their baby boys? Go back to the place where they had prayed to God for so long to rescue them from? Like, go back to that place? Really? Yeah, I mean, God was concerned that if faced with the decision to either fight the Philistines for their freedom or to return to Egypt as slaves, that they'd choose slavery. Now, to us freedom-loving, undefeated in 2 world wars, beat the redcoats with a ragtag group of musketeers, I'll see your armies and I'll raise you, our Navy SEALs, red-blooded Americans that we are, we might look at that verse and go, that's just the price of freedom. You got to fight for it, cowards. We just celebrated Memorial Day, right? I mean, like we intentionally remind ourselves every year that freedom is not free, that it comes at the courage and the loss of life of men and women. Okay, but it's worth it, right? It's worth it. Come on, Israel, pick up a sword, take the straight line road, get to your promised land, kill a few Philistines in the process. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? Well, here's the deal, and here's what God knew, okay? When your security depends on people who are also a real danger to you. Now just get your mind around that for a second. Because some of us know exactly what I'm talking about there, but some of us don't. When your security, when your safety depends on people who are also a real danger to you, then facing more danger doesn't seem like a good option. It just doesn't in that situation. I mean, sure, the Egyptians were slave masters and they were brutal ones, just like we already saw. They weren't just a threat, they made good on that threat. They were a real danger. But they were a known danger. The Israelites knew them. They knew how to survive under them, even under their brutality. They knew how to appease them. I mean, it wasn't good, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't ideal, but it was familiar. And some of us have lived that dynamic out. We know what that's like. We felt that. We've lived that. Because some of us grew up in homes where mom or dad wasn't safe. Some of us have left or might even still be in marriages where home isn't safe. So some of us get that. We know it's not right, we know it's not good, but we at least know what we're in for. And in that situation where you've been beat down, sometimes literally, time and time again, the idea of like fighting your way to freedom, it doesn't really feel like an option. So, but let me say that maybe just a little bit differently. When you've been forced to accept and survive in some kind of bondage, when you've been forced to do that, fighting for your freedom, that's terrifying. Terrifying, right? Because why? Because the key to surviving in bondage, which is what you're used to, the key to surviving in bondage is to always be on the lookout for danger and to avoid it. Like, that's the standard operating procedure. That's what you know, and you've probably become kind of good at doing. Now, we're going to keep that up on the screen here just for a second, because here's what I know. I know that right now, I'm probably treading on some pretty sensitive ground for more than a few of us listening. I know that what I'm saying, it might even be kind of triggering some anxiety or some fear, some shame. And so I want you to know, just for a moment here, I'm aware of that, and I'm going to be treading very carefully, okay? But just look at these statements one more time, okay? When you've been forced to accept, survive in bondage, fighting for your freedom, then it's terrifying. It just is. Because what you're used to is just always being on the lookout for danger. We see this dynamic play out in abusive marriages, abusive parenting relationships, right? We've seen it play out in the Me Too stories. We see it play out as an explanation in terms of why it's so hard for those who have been victimized to bring themselves, to share their story. And those are the more traumatic cases, and then when they're high profile, those are the ones that kind of make the headlines. But here's what I think. I think that that this same dynamic plays out in most, if not all, of our lives. Because I think on some level, maybe not all of us know what abuse is like, but we do know, most of us know, what bondage, what being enslaved to something feels like. We've most of us have this place in our lives where we wish things were different, but we've just learned to accept that they probably never will be. That's bondage. That's being enslaved to something. It's that thing that you've worked so hard to try and change or improve, or get free from, get past, but it still has a hold on you. That's bondage. That's being enslaved to something. It's the places in your life that you're tempted to and often settle for keeping hidden away. That's bondage. That's the feel. I think that's pretty close to universal. Because we know that in that area of our lives, we're bound up. We're a prisoner. It almost feels like we're not even really calling the shots. I mean, sure, we know that we're technically still the one making these decisions, but on some level, it's just like, I know what I'm doing, but I wish I wasn't. I wish I didn't feel compelled to do that. I wish I didn't fall into that. I wish I could get free from that. Might be a habit, a sin, a pattern, whatever it is. It's bondage because you're enslaved to it. Okay? And God knows, right? He knows that about us, and he knew that about his people back then as well. So let's get back to the story in Exodus 13. God knew this. He knew this about his people. He knew what their bondage had done to them. He knew that. He knew where they were at. He knew how they felt. He knew how they were thinking in light of that. He knew how it affected them. How their bondage had imprinted itself on them, how it rewired their view of themselves and their view of the world that they lived in. And so this isn't a God isn't a God who's going to take them from the horrors of the whip and rush them immediately into the horrors of a ground war where they have to cut and stab their way to freedom. They weren't going to be ready for that. He knew that. And so you don't probably know much about who the Philistines were, but they were formidable. Okay, we know that Egypt was a powerhouse. The Philistines actually attacked and took ground from Pharaoh and Egypt along the border when they would skirmish. So make no mistake about it. The call out of bondage in Egypt into the promised land wasn't like a bus tour across the plains. Okay, it would have been scary even for the most battle-hardened Navy SEAL types. But that's the thing. We're not talking about a group of highly disciplined special forces personnel. We're talking about a caravan of moms and dads and grandpas and grandmas and kids of all ages and pregnant women. And then we got sheep and goats and donkeys, all of whom had only known a world where they relied upon their slave masters for their security, for their safety, for their next meal. Where bondage and surviving it was the norm, not freedom. And so God knows, and in his grace, what he does, he just leads them along a different route. So here's the lesson for us in that, okay? We can be sure that as God calls us to take scary steps towards freedom, and they are when you're in bondage, any step, even small ones, scary. But so here's what we know. We can be sure that as God calls us to take those steps, that he's going to lead us on paths that are right for us, right where we're at. Right where we're at. Our freedom rests. Before it rests on our courage or our fighting or anything else, it rests on him leading us well. For the Israelites, it was, you are not ready to go to war. You're not. You've been in bondage for the last 30 years. So he knew that about them, and he took them on a different route. That's how it worked with them. The first thing he does isn't give them a sword and tell them to fight their way to freedom. It's to take them on a different path. Still scary, but way better for who they were and just where they were at. I just connect the dots here. I'm 41. I had back surgery at 38. And I had back surgery because I had an arthritic joint that was ended up being right in the smack middle of my back. But it had gotten so arthritic, which is weird for a 38-year-old, gotten so arthritic that it started pinching my spinal cord. And the reason I knew about it is that my legs started to lose feeling and strength. So they took care of that problem. I had surgery and fixed the joint, and I don't have anything pinching on my spinal cord that I know of. But before my surgery, 37 and on down, if I wanted to, lose weight or get back in shape or, even just whatever, it was always intensive. It was intensive exercise or signing up for a kickboxing class or playing a softball or pick up basketball or something competitive, something kind of fast paced. It was all the things because that's kind of who I was and what I preferred. Not so much where I'm at anymore. Not so much. And because I'm not in that place, those things don't make sense for me anymore. They just don't. In fact, they kind of hurt. They kind of hurt, and they also make me super frustrated because I remember what I used to be able to do, right? But where I'm at is it's just different. It's just different. And because I'm in a different place, it calls for a different path forward. Different path forward. So listen. God knows where you're at. He knows. He knows exactly. He knows exactly where you're at. And although the path that he's put ahead of you, whatever that is, it might still feel a little scary, because it always does. Even so, here's what you know, and here's what you can rely on. It's the right path for you because he takes where you're at into account. He takes where you're at into account. It's kind of the kernel of truth in this familiar and mostly misguided saying. But there's a kernel of truth in it. You probably heard it. It's the saying of God's never give it. He's never going to let you. Let's say this again. God's never going to give you any more than you can handle. Right? You've heard that, right? Now, that's, again, mostly terribly naive, misguided, mostly unbiblical, not true saying. because yes, he does, and yes, he will. I'd be like, have you read the Bible? But there is a kernel of truth in it. There is. And that's this. He's not going to give you more than what he knows is right for you because he knows right where you're at. He's not. He's not going to give you more. Your freedom does not depend on you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Your freedom depends on him knowing where you're at and leading you well. You can know that, and you can rely on that. You can even rest in that. Okay, so keep going with me in the story because God gives them some other things that he knows they need because of where they're at. And in verse 19, chapter 13, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid and you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So it's kind of a callback to a previous episode, and you're going to be lost if you didn't watch the previous episode kind of deal. But in Genesis, right before Exodus, Joseph, who was the ancestor of all of these Israelites, the guy who God placed and grew up to be the number 2 man in charge of Egypt, and who provided a place for these descendants of his to grow and become prosperous for almost 400 years, Joseph made a prediction that one day God would settle his descendants in their own land. And when God did that, Joseph said, you should bury me in it, okay? And so remember what they did in Egypt. I mean, if you know anything about Egypt, when someone in royalty dies, what did they do in Egypt at this time? Well, they mummified you, right? If you were royalty and you died, you were a mummy. And so Joseph's mummy, preserved 400 years later, is now being carried at the head of this caravan to be buried in their new home. And so here the people of Israel are 400 years later as they're taking their first few scary steps towards freedom with this visual reminder that the God of Joseph 400 years ago is real, and he's still alive, and he's still present, and he's still in charge, and he keeps his promises. It's this visual reminder. Now, not only that, okay, God gives them even some crazier visual reminders. Here, verse 20, after leaving Sukkoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert, and by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and then by night in a pillar of fire to give them light so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. See, God knows where they're at and what they need. He just does. He knows, and so he gives it to them. You're on the right path. Look at the cloud. Look at the fire. Keep going. Follow me. Keep going. Keep going. I am with you. All right. So, as cool as all of that is, we haven't even got to like the coolest part of the story, and this is really where we're going to end. So, chapter 14, verse 1. Let's read the first 4 verses here. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back. So after they've been on this journey, turn back and encamp near Pi. That's how you pronounce that. It's Hebrew. And between Migdal and the sea. So they're by the Red Sea, okay? So if you remember that map, they start south and then they get to where the Red Sea kind of comes up. So, you're basically trapped. They're to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this, okay? So let's just make sure we're tracking here, because God's kind of a military genius here, it turns out. But what he says to Moses basically is this. Have the people backtrack a little bit, make it seem like they're wandering, camp them right by the sea so they're kind of trapped, make it look like they're lost. And then God says this crazy thing. He says that I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And that Pharaoh will once again, just like he did before, he'll change his mind, he'll come after the Israelites and he'll try to force them back into slavery. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. That might raise a few eyebrows, because is that saying that God overrides Pharaoh's will? That he not only baits Pharaoh with some fake wandering, but he actually forces Pharaoh into making this decision? Is that what it's saying? Well, just put a pin in that question just for a second. Keep reading with me into verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, okay, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We've let the Israelites go. We've lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready, and he took his entire army with him. So, very next verse, it seems to indicate that it wasn't God overriding Pharaoh's will. It was Pharaoh making that decision free and of his own accord to change his mind about letting the Israelites go and instead pursuing them. So which is it? Is it God in charge as he pulls the puppet strings? Or is it Pharaoh kind of making his own free will decisions? The old free will debate. Let's do that after 30 minutes of talking, right? Well, this is probably one of my favorite things about the Bible, because the answer to that is yes. Yep. It's both. What it is it's God knowing exactly what Pharaoh will do if, and then using Pharaoh's free will and evil decision-making for his own purposes. God is able to know and plan for even our free will, which means that this paradox is also true, and this is what the Israelites lived. Even when our worst fears are realized, God is still in control. Because our worst fears are realized when people sometimes they exercise their evil free will. Even when our worst fears are realized, God's still in control. I mean, put yourselves into the shoes of the Israelite caravan when all this was playing out. Every day as they were traveling, I'm sure there were people in that caravan looking over their shoulder, looking back to the horizon just to check. And every day it was just that. It was just the horizon until one day it wasn't. There was a cloud of dust, and there was kind of like some, probably black dots, and then it became really apparent. It's Pharaoh and his army coming after us. Worst fears realized. They were doomed. They were by the sea. Pharaoh's coming, sea behind them. Verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified. They cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to just serve the Egyptians than to just die in the desert, right? When all you've known is bondage. At least it's something that you know. There it is. When your security depends on people who are also a real danger to you, then any sort of risk feels like it's out of the question. But Moses is ready with his answer, because even when our worst fears are realized, here's what Moses knew. God is still in control. Verse 13, he says this. Moses answered the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians will see you see today, you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. Be still. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. Be still. Let's put that on the screen, okay? There it is. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. Be still. Life with God gets pretty dangerous sometimes, because the world's a dangerous place. Even when our worst fears are realized, even when God is still in control. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a moment and allow some kind of music and things kind of wash over us here as we kind of ponder this, and then we're going to create some space for us to interact. Let me pray really quick for us before we do that. Father in heaven, some of us maybe are walking through some dangerous things. God, with the truth of this story, when our backs are against the wall and we're seeing something coming, with the truth of this story, the direction that you gave through your servant Moses, make it through to our hearts today. Jesus, we pray this in your name. Amen.